She came to Iron Creek Ranch to cook. That was the deal. A wagon, a stove, and a husband who needed meals on the table, not a business partner. But when Savannah Mercer opened the ranch's books and saw the numbers bleeding red, she didn't reach for a handkerchief. She reached for a skillet. What followed would shake the Wyoming frontier to its core. A woman nobody believed in, a marriage built on transaction, and a ruthless railroad man who thought he could break her with a single ultimatum. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The wagon road into Iron Creek Ranch was nothing but frozen mud and broken promise, and Savannah Mercer sat on the buckboard with her hands folded in her lap like she was attending her own trial. She was 29 years old, which in 1882 Wyoming meant she was either married with children or already half forgotten by polite society. She was neither. She had spent 4 years working as a bookkeeper's assistant in Cheyenne, living above a dry goods store and sending money home to her younger sister until her sister no longer needed it. After that, there was nothing particular holding her to that life except habit. And habit, she had decided, was just fear wearing comfortable shoes. The advertisement had appeared in the Cheyenne Gazette on a Tuesday. Rancher seeks capable woman for domestic work. Room and board provided. Marriage arrangement. Must be practical. No delicate constitutions need apply. It was not a romantic notice. That was precisely why she answered it. The man who met her at the edge of the property was not what she had pictured either. Weston Hale was somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that weather had already begun to work on seriously, jaw like a fence post, eyes the color of a river in November, a hat that had seen considerably better years. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he has ordered from a catalog and is not entirely sure arrived correctly. "Savannah Mercer," she said, climbing down without waiting for his hand. "Weston Hale." He didn't offer the hand anyway. "You're smaller than I expected." "You're quieter than I expected," she said. The letter had a lot of words in it. He studied her for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the house, and she followed, because there was nowhere else to go. Iron Creek Ranch sat in a wide basin between two ridgelines, the kind of land that looked impressive from a distance and revealed its struggles up close. The main house was solid enough, 2 stories, good timber, a stone fireplace that still drew properly, but the outbuildings were showing their age, and the barn roof on the east side had a sag in it that nobody had gotten around to fixing. The bunkhouse sat 30 yards from the house, and from it came the sounds of men who worked hard and slept hard and did not particularly care who had just arrived. There were 7 ranch hands in all. She learned their names over the first week. Pete Rourke, the foreman, a compact Irishman with a gray beard and an opinion on everything. Cal Dunnigan and his younger brother Trace, who were inseparable and nearly identical. A quiet Cheyenne man called Joseph Red Cloud, who had worked the property longer than anyone else. A teenager named Eli, who was still growing into his own limbs. And 2 others, Dutch and Harmon, who kept largely to themselves. Weston explained her role with the efficiency of a man reading from a list. Breakfast at 5:30. Dinner at noon if we're on the property, packed meals if we're out in the far pasture. Supper at 6. The kitchen needs reorganizing. The woman before you left things in a state. Laundry on Mondays. If something breaks in the house, tell Pete. And between meals? Savannah asked. He blinked. What about between meals? What do I do between meals? He looked at her like the question itself was unusual. Whatever needs doing. It was not a cruel answer. It was simply the answer of a man who had never stopped to consider that time had any shape other than the shape of work. Savannah nodded and went to inspect the kitchen. The kitchen was, as he had said, in a state. The previous woman, nobody ever gave her name, which Savannah found quietly troubling, had organized things according to a system that made sense only to herself. Flour in a coffee tin. Coffee in a sack that had previously held rock salt. The cast iron skillet, which was actually excellent, hanging in a spot where the ceiling's draft would cool it before it ever got properly hot. Savannah reorganized everything in a single afternoon, working until her shoulders ached. She was not a naturally domestic woman in the way that word was used. She didn't love cooking for its own sake, didn't find deep satisfaction in the smell of bread, but she was organized and precise, and she understood that a kitchen was essentially a logistics problem, and logistics were something she was very good at. She cooked breakfast at 5:30 as required. Biscuits, salt pork, strong coffee, and a pot of oats with molasses because she'd noticed that two of the younger hands weren't getting enough actual food for the work they were expected to do. Pete Rourke sat down, ate half his plate, and said, without looking up, "Better than the last one." "High praise," Savannah said. "Ba mosarim, Savannah ye." He did look up then, trying to decide if she was being smart with him. She kept her expression neutral and refilled his coffee. In those first weeks, she learned the ranch the way she had learned every job she'd ever held, by paying attention to things other people stopped noticing. She watched the hands come in at night, saw which ones ate in silence and which ones ate in something close to despair. She watched Weston most of all. He was not a difficult man exactly. He wasn't unkind or given to tempers, but there was a tension in him that never fully left, a tightening around the eyes when he looked at the far pasture, a pause before he answered questions about the cattle that lasted just a beat too long. He ate his meals efficiently and thanked her each time with the same exact phrasing, "Good supper, Mrs. Hale," as if he had decided on those words and saw no reason to vary them. She had agreed to the marriage for practical reasons. He had agreed to it for the same. They were two adults who understood the arrangement, and she respected that clarity even when it made the evenings feel very long. What she did not expect in that third week was the ledger. Yet, she found it by accident. She was looking for the household account book. She wanted to understand how much she was permitted to spend at the general store in Mill Haven, the nearest town. And she opened the wrong drawer in the roll-top desk in the front room. The ledger was worn at the spine and the handwriting changed 3 times across its pages, which meant it had been kept by at least 3 different people over the years. She should have closed it. It was not her book. She read it instead. It took her 2 hours sitting at that desk with the lamp burning low to understand what the numbers were saying. And what they were saying was not good. Iron Creek Ranch had been in debt for 4 years. Not ordinary debt, not a bank loan against a good harvest or a mortgage on expanding acreage. This was a kind of creeping, worsening debt, the kind that accumulated when cattle prices dropped and didn't recover, when one bad winter wiped out a quarter of the herd, when equipment failed and had to be replaced on credit, when the interest compounded quietly in the background like water finding its way under a foundation. The figure at the bottom of the most recent page made her sit back in the chair. The bank in Laramie held a note against the property. The note was due in 7 months. The amount was not something that could be met by selling cattle, not at current prices, not with the herd they had. She turned the pages back and forward twice, checking her arithmetic, hoping she'd misread something. She hadn't. She closed the ledger. She put it back in the drawer. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she went to bed, and in the morning she made breakfast, and she did not say anything. Not yet. Because she needed to think first, and thinking was something she preferred to do alone. She thought for 3 days. On the 4th day, she drove the supply wagon into Mill Haven to collect the weekly order from the general store. The road ran parallel to the railroad grade for about 6 miles, and as she drove, she could see the work camps stretched along the line, dozens of tents and makeshift structures, hundreds of men, the smoke from cook fires rising in thin columns against the gray sky. The Union Pacific spur line was pushing west through this part of Wyoming, and it had been pushing for 2 years, which meant it had accumulated a workforce of considerable size. She slowed the wagon without particularly meaning to and watched a cluster of workers waiting at what appeared to be a food wagon. The wagon was badly maintained. The man running it was charging, as far as she could tell from the chalkboard leaned against its side, 35 cents for a plate of beans and bread. She did the arithmetic in her head without effort. 300 men, 35 cents a plate. Once a day, minimum. That was over $100 a day. More if breakfast and supper were included. The food wagon's bread, from what she could see at this distance, was the kind of bread that happened to bread when nobody cared much about it. The beans looked thin, the men eating them looked resigned. She drove on to Mill Haven, completed her shopping, and drove back. On the return trip, she slowed again at the same stretch of road. She was still thinking when she unhitched the team and put the horses up for the evening. That night, after supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Weston was at his desk, she could see the lamplight under the study door. She sat at the kitchen table and worked through the numbers. What she needed was not complicated to understand. It was complicated to execute. She would need a wagon fitted properly for mobile cooking, a proper stove, ventilation, a water barrel, covered storage. She would need supplies in much larger quantities than the household required. She would need a route and a schedule, and someone willing to drive while she cooked. She wrote figures in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. She crossed things out and rewrote them. She added columns and subtracted back. Then she went to bed. Except, the next morning she waited until after breakfast, when Weston was lingering over his second cup of coffee. He always took a second cup on days when the weather was too bad for early outdoor work, and it had sleeted overnight, and she sat down across from him with her notebook. "I need to talk to you about the ledger," she said. He went very still, just for a second, but she saw it. "Which ledger?" he said. "The one in the right-hand drawer of the roll top." A muscle in his jaw moved. "That's not your concern." "I think it is," she said. "I think it's both our concern, since my name is on the same deed your name is on." That wasn't strictly true yet, but they both understood the implication. 7 months is not a lot of time, he set his cup down. "Where did you learn to read a ledger like that?" "I worked for a bookkeeper for 4 years. I've seen what a ledger looks like when the numbers are healthy, and I've seen what they look like when they aren't." She slid the notebook across the table. "I have an idea." He looked at the notebook without touching it. "Does it involve cattle?" "No." "Then what does it involve?" "The railroad work camps," she said. 10 miles from here, maybe more. I drove past them last week on the supply run. They're feeding 300 men or more on food that isn't fit for the effort those men are putting out. They're paying 35 cents a plate for it. I think we can do better, and I think we can undercut that price and still turn a profit that would significantly change the picture in that ledger. Weston looked at her. His expression was not hostile exactly. It was more like a man hearing a language he recognized but couldn't quite follow. "You want to cook for the railroad camps." "I want to run a food operation for the railroad camps, out of a wagon, maybe more than one wagon, depending on how it grows." "You're the house cook," he said. It was not said with cruelty. It was said the way a man states a fact that seems to him self-evident. "I'm your wife," she said, "and this ranch is going to go to the bank in 7 months if something doesn't change. I'm not asking for your blessing. I'm asking for one wagon and whatever we can spend at the hardware supplier in Laramie." The silence that followed was the particular kind that meant a man was rethinking something he thought was already settled. "You'd still cook for the hands," he said. "I'll cook for the hands. And if it doesn't work, then we're no worse off than we already are." She pulled the notebook back toward her. "I've done the numbers. The margin is workable. The demand is there. I could see it with my own eyes. What we need is the will to try." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "One wagon," he said. Pete Rourke heard about it from Weston, which meant everyone heard about it by noon. The reaction from the bunkhouse was not warm. "She wants to do what?" Cal Dunnigan said, at a volume Savannah could hear clearly through the open window above the wash basin. "Sell food to the rail crews," Pete said. Like a lunch wagon." "That's not ranch work," Trace said. "It's not her business is what it is," Dutch said. Savannah dried her hands on a towel and went back to kneading the bread she had started before breakfast. She had expected this. She was not hurt by it exactly. She was more interested in it, the way you're interested in a problem that needs solving. Joseph Red Cloud came to the kitchen door that afternoon while she was taking stock of the pantry. He was a quiet man, older than the others, and he tended to think before he spoke in a way that Savannah found she respected. "The others are saying it won't work," he said. "I know. They might be right." "They might be," she agreed. She made a note in her book. "What do you think?" He considered this for a moment. "I think the railroad crews eat badly. I have seen their camps. I think anyone who gave those men a decent plate of food would have more customers than they could handle." He paused. "But I also think a woman running a wagon alone in a rail camp is going to run into problems that aren't about the food. Which is why I'm going to need someone who knows how to handle himself to drive the wagon," she said, without looking up from her notebook. "I was going to ask if you were interested." The silence was brief but meaningful. "How much?" he said. $12 a week, which is 4 more than you make now, and meals." Another pause. "When do we start?" Getting the wagon ready took 11 days, which was faster than anyone expected because Savannah worked on it herself. She and Joseph drove to Laramie with a list and came back with a second-hand stove that was heavy as sin and needed some repairs to the firebox, 100 feet of stovepipe, a water barrel with a proper spigot, hinged side panels that could be lowered to create a serving counter, and enough hardware and lumber to build storage underneath. Eli, the teenage hand, had some woodworking ability and a general eagerness to be useful that Savannah found valuable. She put him to work on the wagon 2 afternoons a week when his other duties allowed, and he took to it with the straightforward enthusiasm of a young person who has been given something specific to do. Weston watched from a distance. He didn't interfere and he didn't help. He stood at the barn door one evening and watched her and Joseph wrestle the stove into position on the wagon bed. And when she looked up and caught his eye, he didn't say anything, just turned and went back inside. She didn't know what to make of him. He was present and absent at the same time, like a figure in a painting that has depth but can't actually be touched. They made their first run on a Tuesday in early October. Savannah had spent 2 days preparing, 100 pounds of beans cooked overnight in 3 great pots, 24 loaves of bread, 20 pounds of salt pork, dried apple pie in tins, and enough coffee to supply a regiment. The quantities were frightening, far more than she had ever cooked for a single meal, and she had doubted herself at 2 in the morning when the kitchen smelled overwhelmingly of beans, and the fire in the stove had gotten away from her briefly and scorched the 3rd pot's bottom. She fixed it. She added water and seasoning and stirred until the scorched flavor was gone, and then she stood at the kitchen window for 5 minutes and breathed. Joseph had the wagon hitched by 4:30. Savannah loaded the food in insulated boxes she'd sewn from canvas and packed with straw, which she'd read about in an old Army quartermaster's manual she'd found in the town library in Mill Haven. The boxes worked better than she'd expected. They reached the first work camp at 6:15, just as the morning shift was coming off the overnight work, and the day shift was pulling on its coats. Savannah let down the side panels. She set up the serving counter. She put the coffee pot on the stove and got the fire going. And then she waited. The first man to approach was a Pole who spoke almost no English. He pointed at the bread and held up 2 fingers and gave her a quarter. She made change from the tin box in her apron and handed him 2 thick slices with a ladle of beans across the top, which was not traditional but turned out to be the right thing to do because he ate it in approximately 40 seconds and came back for more. After him came 6 more, then 20. Then the word traveled. She could see it physically, one man turning to tell another, pointing back at the wagon. And within 45 minutes, there was a line 40 men deep. She ran out of bread first, then the apple pies. She cut the beans tighter to make them stretch and kept the coffee coming because she had brought enough coffee for twice what she'd expected to need, having suspected that coffee was where she would be most wrong. She was not wrong about that. At 8:15, they were out of everything. Joseph was quiet on the drive back. He was not a talkative man generally, but somewhere around the 4th mile he said, without preamble, "You should have brought twice as much." "I know," she said. "We will next time." She counted the tin in her apron during a stretch of smooth road. $14.60 in 2 hours. She stared at the number for a moment. Then she put the tin back in her pocket. $14.60 for 2 hours of work. Compared to the $7 a week she'd planned for household expenses. She started recalculating in her head, and she didn't stop until they were back at the ranch. The second run was 3 days later, with twice the food. By the end of October, they were going out 4 days a week. By mid-November, Savannah was pulling in over $60 on a good day. She was reinvesting almost all of it. More ingredients, better equipment, a second insulated box system she'd improved from her first design, and paying Joseph his wage and setting aside a strict portion for the ranch's debt account, which she kept in a separate column in her notebook. Weston knew the numbers. She gave him a weekly accounting every Sunday evening, written clearly in her notebook so he could review it himself. He read them in silence and handed the book back each time. He never said much. "This is working," she told him, the 3rd Sunday in November. "I can see that," he said. "The banknote is in 7 months. If the income stays consistent, we can make a significant payment by spring. Enough to renegotiate the terms, possibly." She paused. "I need to talk to you about adding a second wagon." He looked up from the notebook. "You want to expand." "I need to expand. There are 3 more work camps within 15 miles that I can't reach with 1 wagon on a 4-day schedule. I'm turning away business because I can't supply it." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the notebook over in his hands. He was not reading it anymore. He was thinking, the way she was coming to recognize that he thought, not dramatically, not quickly, but with a steadiness that eventually arrived somewhere. "Where would we get the wagon?" he said. "Billings Fletcher has one for sale. It's in reasonable shape. I can make it work." "How much?" she told him. He didn't flinch at the number. That was something she had noticed about him. He did not perform financial reactions. He either had the money or he didn't. "We can cover that from the ranch account," he said. "Just good." She reached for the notebook. "There's something else." "There usually is," he said. It wasn't unfriendly. It was almost, she thought, something close to dry humor, which she hadn't expected from him. "The widow Carver on the South Road. She has 3 children, and she's been taking in laundry to survive since her husband died last spring. She can cook. I've tasted her food at the church social. I want to hire her to manage the second wagon." "You want to hire a widow to run a food wagon?" "I want to hire a competent cook who needs the income." "Yes." Weston looked at the ceiling briefly, which was, she had learned, what he did when he was not objecting to something but needed a moment to catch up to it. "What does she know about running a wagon?" "About as much as I knew 3 months ago," Savannah said, which turned out to be enough. Another long pause. "All right," he said, "but I want to know what you're paying her before you offer it." 12 a week and meals." He nodded, a single motion. "Fine." She put the notebook away. She stood up to go back to the kitchen. At the doorway, she stopped. "Weston." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. She didn't say it simply because it was polite. She said it because she meant it, specifically and carefully, in the way she meant most things she said. He held her gaze for a moment. His expression was not exactly readable. It never was, quite. But something in it had shifted slightly. "You've been working very hard," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I have." She went back to the kitchen and began planning for the week ahead. By December, the operation had taken on a life of its own that surprised even Savannah. Margaret Carver turned out to be a formidable cook, who also possessed an ability to command a line of hungry men with the calm authority of someone who had raised children alone and found it good preparation for most of life's other difficulties. She ran the second wagon with a competence that made Savannah feel something she hadn't expected to feel in this arrangement: relief. The relief of not being the only person who understood what she was trying to do. Cal Dunnigan, who had been the loudest skeptic in the bunkhouse, asked Savannah in the second week of December if there was work driving the supply wagon on Thursdays. His reasoning, delivered with some difficulty to his own boots, was that his horse had gone lame and the driving work would pay better than ranch hand wages while the horse recovered. Savannah hired him at a driver's wage and set him to hauling supplies from Millhaven twice a week. He turned out to be reliable, and when not in the company of his brother, and therefore not performing for an audience, actually quite pleasant to work alongside. Trace hired on 2 weeks later with less preamble. Eli drove the second wagon on Saturdays, beaming with a pride that was complicated enough in a boy his age that Savannah chose not to comment on it directly, just made sure he was paid fairly and thanked specifically. By Christmas, Iron Creek Ranch had become something none of them had quite planned for: a community. Not a perfect one. There were days when the stove on the first wagon developed a draft problem that put smoke into the food and required Savannah to make public apologies to a line of hungry workers while Joseph fiddled with the stovepipe in a condition of barely contained fury. There were days when the weather was genuinely hostile and the road was so bad that arriving at the camp at all was a small victory in itself. There were arguments about supply costs and one genuine financial crisis in mid-November when a supplier in Laramie failed to deliver and she had to improvise an entire day's menu from what she had on hand, which involved a considerable amount of cornmeal and creative seasoning. But the money was real, and the money was changing what Iron Creek Ranch was. One evening in late December, Savannah was sitting at the kitchen table working through the accounts. The house was quiet. Snow had been falling since afternoon, and the world outside the window was muffled and still. Weston came in from outside, brushing snow from his coat. He hung it on the peg by the door and stood for a moment looking at her, the way he sometimes did, as if she were a feature of the landscape he was still getting used to. "Bad out," he said. "I know. I could hear it." She didn't look up from the notebook. There's coffee. It's been on a while, so it's strong. He poured a cup and sat down across from her, which was unusual. He generally took his evening coffee in the study. She kept working. After a minute, he said, I wasn't sure about this. I know, she said. I mean, I was actively not sure. I thought... He stopped. She looked up. He was turning the coffee cup in both hands, looking at it rather than at her. I thought it was a bad idea, he said. I thought you were... I don't know. Trying to do more than the situation warranted. You might still be right, she said. Give it another few months. He shook his head, a small motion. No, I don't think so. He looked up then. The November eyes were still there, still that same unreadable river gray, but something in the depths of them was different. I think you might have saved this place. Savannah held his gaze. She was not a woman who needed to be told she'd done well. She knew what she'd done. She'd done it on purpose. But there was something in the way he said it that was not just acknowledgement. It was something closer to seeing. I think we're going to need to talk to the bank in Laramie, she said, before the note comes due. I want to approach them with a full accounting and a proposal for renegotiation rather than waiting for them to come to us. That's probably right, he said. I'll need you there. It'll carry more weight with both of us present. He nodded. Just tell me when. February, maybe, when the road's more reliable. February, he agreed. They sat in the quiet for another minute. The snow was audible against the windows, a soft, persistent sound. The coffee's good, he said. It's been on since 4, she said. It's terrible. Something crossed his face that was the closest thing she had yet seen to a smile. It arrived and departed quickly, as if it surprised him as much as it surprised her. Get some sleep, he said, standing. You were up at 4 this morning. I know when I was up, she said. He took his coffee to the study. She went back to the notebook. Outside, the snow fell on Iron Creek Ranch, on the barn with its sagging east roof, on the bunkhouse where 7 men slept who now earned more than they had in November, on the 2 wagons parked in the yard that had started as a desperate idea and become something nobody quite had a name for yet. Savannah finished her calculations, closed the notebook, and put it in her apron pocket. 7 months on the banknote. 6 now. She was going to need them. January came in hard. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made the air itself feel brittle, and the road to the railroad camps turned into something that was equal parts frozen rut and genuine hazard. The wagon wheels cracked against the ground like hammers. The horses blew great clouds of steam. Savannah sat up on the buckboard wrapped in 2 coats and a horse blanket and thought about nothing except the road ahead, because thinking about anything else was a luxury the cold didn't permit. They lost 4 days in January to weather that made travel genuinely dangerous. Not inconvenient, not uncomfortable, but the kind of cold where a man could lose a hand if the wagon broke an axle and he had to work bare-fingered on iron in the wind. On those days, Savannah stayed at the ranch and cooked for the hands and reorganized her supply inventory and did the accounts and tried not to think about what 4 missed days meant in terms of the numbers. It meant a lot, was what it meant. She didn't say this to Weston. He knew how to read a ledger as well as she did. What she did instead was use the downtime to solve problems she hadn't had time to solve properly when the wagons were running. The insulation boxes needed improvement. The beans were arriving at the camp too cool on the coldest mornings, and a worker who paid good money for a meal deserved food that was actually hot. She spent 2 full days rebuilding the interior lining of the boxes with a double-wall method she worked out by trial and error, using scraps of wood and wool felt and tin sheeting, until she had something that held heat measurably better than what she'd started with. Joseph watched her work on the second afternoon. He was repairing harness leather nearby, and for a long time neither of them spoke. You ever stop? He said eventually. When things are working correctly, she said, without looking up. He went back to the leather. After a minute, the men at the camp, the Polish crew, the one near the 3rd mile marker, they asked about you last week. The foreman asked if the wagon would be back. What did you tell him? I told him weather permitting. Good answer, she said. He said they'd been eating from the other wagon, the one that was there before you started coming. He paused. He said the food was worse. Savannah sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd built. Good, she said. The meeting with the bank in Laramie happened on a Thursday in early February, when the road had thawed enough to make the 2-hour drive manageable. Savannah dressed carefully that morning. Not extravagantly. She didn't have extravagant, and wouldn't have worn it if she did, but deliberately. Her good wool dress, which was dark green and serious looking. Her hair pinned up properly. She looked, she thought, like a woman who understood what she was walking into. Weston wore his good coat and shaved, which she noted without comment. The bank manager's name was Aldrich Foss, a man of about 50 with a face that had settled into an expression of permanent mild suspicion, which was probably an occupational hazard. He shook Weston's hand across the desk and nodded at Savannah in the way men like him nodded at women who accompanied their husbands to financial meetings, acknowledging her presence without quite accepting it. Savannah put her notebook on the desk. "I've prepared a full accounting of Iron Creek Ranch's current operations," she said. "Income, expenses, projections through the end of the year, and a specific proposal regarding the outstanding note." Foss looked at the notebook, then at Weston, then back at the notebook. "Mrs. Hale keeps the books," Weston said. There was something flat and final in the way he said it, which Savannah appreciated. Foss picked up the notebook. He read for longer than she expected. She watched his face move through several small adjustments, a slight lift of the brow here, a fractional tightening of the mouth there, and she read those adjustments the way she read everything, carefully and without letting on. "This is a food operation," he said. "Mobile." "Correct. You're supplying railroad work camps." "4 camps currently. We're in discussions to add a 5th. That last part was not entirely accurate. She had spoken to a foreman at a 5th camp once, which was not quite the same as discussions. But it was not entirely false either, and she needed Foss to understand that the trajectory was upward. "And this income," he tapped a figure on the page, "this is monthly?" "That's monthly net after expenses, wages, and supply costs," she said. "The gross is higher. I can show you the full breakdown if you'd like." He set the notebook down. He folded his hands on the desk. "Mr. Hale," he said, turning to Weston with the air of a man who preferred his transactions to have a clear axis. "The note on Iron Creek comes due in April. At current cattle valuations?" "We're aware of the cattle situation," Savannah said, "which is why I'm asking you to look at what we've built in the past 4 months and consider a restructured arrangement. The note amount is fixed, but the repayment schedule isn't. We're proposing a 12-month extension with monthly payments drawn from the food operations income. I've laid out the proposed payment figures on the last page." Foss turned to the last page. He was quiet for a moment. "This is—" He stopped. Started again. "This is more than the minimum interest payment." "Yes. We want to retire the principal, not just service the debt." She held his gaze. "We have the income to do it. What we need is the time." Another silence. Outside the bank's single window, Laramie moved at its usual February pace, slow, cold, and practical. "I'll need to bring this to the board," Foss said finally. "Of course," Savannah said. She took the notebook back, opened it to the rear, and removed a single folded page. "I made a copy of the relevant figures for your review." She placed it on the desk. "We'll need an answer before March 15th. If the board declines, we'll need time to explore other arrangements." Foss looked at the page, then at her, for the first time as a person rather than an accessory to the meeting. "You have other arrangements in mind?" "I always have other arrangements in mind," she said. She didn't, specifically, but it was the right thing to say, and she said it the right way, and Foss heard it correctly. On the drive back, Weston was quiet for the first several miles. The horses moved at a steady clip. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that looked like winter pretending it's spring. "You didn't tell me about the 5th camp," he said. "There isn't one yet," she said. "There's a foreman who seemed interested." He was quiet for another mile. "You lied to a bank manager." "I implied an optimistic interpretation of an ongoing conversation." She kept her eyes on the road. "There's a difference." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was brief and low and surprised sounding, and she filed it away in the part of her mind that was slowly building a picture of who Weston Hale actually was, underneath the fence post jaw and the November eyes. "We'll get the extension," she said. "You think so?" Foss is a practical man. He'd rather have monthly payments on schedule than a ranch property he has to sell at depressed values in a slow market. She adjusted the reins. We gave him a better option. He'll take it. They did get the extension. The letter arrived 10 days later, and Savannah read it standing at the kitchen counter and then folded it precisely and put it in the notebook and went back to planning the week's supply order because there was work to do. March arrived with a softening, and with the softening came the trouble that Savannah had been, if not exactly expecting, at least not surprised to encounter. The trouble had a name: Donovan Hurst. Hurst ran the only other food operation serving the railroad camps in the area. The one Savannah had seen on that first supply run, the sad wagon with the thin beans and the overpriced bread. He had been running it for almost 2 years and had built what amounted to a comfortable monopoly, and comfortable monopolies did not take kindly to competition. She first heard his name from Margaret Carver, who drove the second wagon out to the eastern camps. Margaret came back one Thursday in early March, looking like she'd swallowed something unpleasant and was working out whether to say so. "A man came to the camp today," Margaret said, sitting down at the kitchen table with the directness of someone who preferred bad news delivered quickly. "Stocky fellow, red mustache, works for Hurst. He told 2 of the camp foremen that our food was being stored in unsanitary conditions and that there had been reports of men getting sick." Savannah set down what she was doing. "That's not true." "I know it's not true. You know it's not true. The foreman, though," Margaret spread her hands. "One of them looked at me different after, like he was thinking about it." "Which camp?" "Camp 7. And the big one at the eastern grade, the one they call Ridgeline." Savannah sat down. She pressed her fingers together on the tabletop and thought, "How many men did we lose today?" "None yet. But if that story gets around—" "It'll get around," Savannah said. "Stories like that always do." She was quiet for a moment. "We need the camp doctors." "What?" "Every camp of that size has a company physician or a medical officer. I want to invite them, whoever they are, all of them, to inspect our operation, the wagons, the storage, everything. I want written confirmation that the food handling is clean and the product is safe." She stood up. "If Hurst wants to play this way, we'll play it back." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "You're not angry?" "I'm very angry," Savannah said. "I'm just not going to let it make me stupid." Plus, getting the camp physicians to do an inspection was more complicated than she'd anticipated because they were busy men and not naturally inclined to see a food vendor's request as a priority. Joseph spent 2 days simply tracking down who was responsible for medical oversight at each camp. One of the camps, it turned out, didn't have a physician at all. They had a man who had studied medicine for 2 years and then abandoned it to work on the railroad, which was not exactly the same thing but was what was available. Savannah offered each of them a free meal in exchange for their time. This proved effective. They came on a Saturday morning in mid-March. 3 men, one of them the incomplete physician, all of them skeptical in the way that busy men are skeptical when they've been pulled away from something else. Savannah walked them through every element of the operation. The storage boxes, fully rebuilt now, clean, with no contamination issues. The cooking process. The water barrel, which was filled fresh each morning from the ranch's well. The way the food was handled from preparation to serving. The senior physician, a compact man named Alderson, who wore his coat like it was a uniform, watched her work through a serving demonstration with the expression of someone who had expected to find a problem and was mildly irritated not to. "The temperature control on these storage containers is better than most restaurant kitchens I've inspected," he said. "I designed them myself," Savannah said. "Double wall construction, wool insulation, tin lining." "Where did you learn to do that?" "A quartermaster's manual and a lot of trial and error," she said. "Mostly error at first." He almost smiled. He wrote something in his notebook. In the end, all 3 men signed a brief statement confirming that the Iron Creek food operation met and exceeded reasonable sanitation standards for mobile food service. Savannah thanked them, fed them properly, and had the statement copied twice before the week was out. She sent a copy to each of the camp foremen who had been spoken to by Hurst's man. She kept the original. The foreman at Camp 7, a German named Brauer, who was generally economical with words, came to her wagon the following Tuesday and said, without preamble, "I heard about what you did, the doctors." "Did it help?" she asked. "Ja," he said. "It helped." He ordered 40 meals, which was 8 more than he'd ordered the previous week, and he paid in advance, which he had never done before. What Savannah did not account for, because she couldn't have, was that Donovan Hurst would take the physician inspection personally. She heard about his reaction through Cal Dunnigan, who had a gift for collecting information from various sources and depositing it, unasked, wherever he happened to be standing. "Hurst is angry," Cal reported, climbing off the supply wagon one afternoon in late March. Properly angry, not just business annoyed. He went to 2 of the foremen himself, apparently. Said you went over his head, went to the company doctors to make him look bad. "I went to the company doctors to protect my reputation," Savannah said. "I know that. You know that. Hurst's version is different." Cal tied off the team with the particular competence of a man who has done it 10,000 times. "He's got some connection to one of the railroad's purchasing officers. Word is he's going to try to get you excluded from the camps through official channels." Savannah looked at him. "Excluded how?" "Some kind of vendor registration system. The railroad's been talking about formalizing who can sell at the camps. Liability reasons mostly. Hurst apparently thinks he can get himself registered and everyone else locked out." This was new information, and not good information, and Savannah absorbed it carefully. "When?" she said. "Nobody seems to know. Could be weeks. Could be sooner." She thanked him. She went back inside. She stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the yard where the 2 wagons were parked, and thought about what she'd built. The roots, the workers who depended on her food, the wages she was paying to people who had needed them badly, the debt payments going to Laramie on schedule. She thought about what it would mean to have that taken away by a man with a red mustache and a friend in a purchasing office. Then she went to her notebook and started writing. There were 2 things she understood clearly. She could not match Hurst's connections inside the railroad company's administrative structure, and she would not win a direct political fight with someone who had been embedded in that structure longer than she had. What she could do was make herself valuable enough to the camps themselves that excluding her became a problem for the railroad, not a solution. That meant more than food. She started with the small things she'd already been doing but hadn't thought of strategically. The extra portions for men who looked underfed, the coffee that ran late on cold mornings, the fact that she and Margaret learned names and remembered dietary issues without being asked. A man named Kowalski had a stomach condition that made beans difficult. She had been substituting bread and cheese for him without charging extra for 2 months, just because she'd noticed. She formalized this practice across all the camps. Then she expanded. She started carrying basic medical supplies. Nothing complex, just clean bandaging material, carbolic solution for wound cleaning, and a basic kit for minor injuries. Cal drove them to the camps and handled the distribution himself, since he turned out to have some practical knowledge of wound care from years of ranch work. This was not a food service, but it was a service, and the camp foreman noticed. She started carrying letters. This one came from Joseph, who pointed out that a significant portion of the Polish, Italian, and Czech workers couldn't read English well enough to understand correspondence from the railroad company, pay statements, safety notices, work schedule changes, and that this created a constant low-level anxiety in the camps that sometimes boiled over into disputes. He knew enough Polish to help, and Savannah hired a young woman from Millhaven named Rosa Escher, who spoke fluent Italian and passable Czech, to come out twice a week and read and explain company documents to the workers. Rosa was paid fairly. She was also, it turned out, the cousin of one of the foremen at the Western camp, and this connection produced a warmth toward Iron Creek's operation that no amount of good food alone could have generated. By the end of March, Savannah's wagons were not just food suppliers to the railroad camps. They were something closer to a field service, feeding men, tending minor injuries, bridging language gaps, carrying news. The camps had come to rely on them the way you rely on something you didn't know you needed until it was there. She wrote all of this up carefully. Not for the camps, they already knew it. She wrote it up for herself, in precise columns, because she had a feeling she was going to need to show it to someone eventually. She just didn't know yet who that someone would be. It was Weston who told her about Victor Langford. He came in from town one Wednesday evening in early April, with a look on his face that she had come to recognize as the look of a man carrying news he hasn't sorted out how to deliver yet. He sat down at the supper table and ate without talking for 10 minutes, which was longer than usual even for him. "There's a man coming through," he said finally. "Railroad executive, out of Chicago. Name's Langford." Savannah looked up. "Coming through Millhaven?" "Coming through the whole territory, reviewing operations along the spur line. What's working, what isn't, what gets contracted, and what gets cut." Weston put his fork down. "Pete heard it from the land agent, who heard it from somebody at the telegraph office. Langford is the man who decides vendor contracts for the whole Western Division." The whole Western Division. That meant every camp she was serving and every camp she wasn't. "When?" she said. 2 weeks? Maybe 3. She nodded slowly. She reached for her coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "Hearst knows he's coming," Weston said. "Pete heard that too. Hearst has been to Millhaven twice in the past week. He's been very busy." "I'm sure he has," Savannah said. Weston looked at her across the table. The lamp between them threw uneven light, and his face was half in shadow the way it often was in the evenings, and he was watching her with an attention that he didn't always show. "You're not worried," he said. "I'm worried," she said. "I'm just not done thinking yet." "What are you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April wind moved against the house with the particular restlessness of weather that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that a man who comes all the way from Chicago to review operations is not going to be impressed by the same things that impress a camp foreman. He's going to want numbers and scale and efficiency." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I'm thinking that what we have is actually more impressive than what Hearst has, if it's presented correctly. I'm thinking the problem isn't what we've built. It's whether we get the chance to show it. And if Hearst gets to him first?" She met his eyes. "Then I need to get to him first." Weston was quiet for a moment. Then, "How?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'll figure it out." She said it without bravado. She said it the way she said most things, with the plain confidence of someone who has been proved right enough times to trust her own judgment, and wrong enough times to know she wasn't infallible. She washed the supper dishes. She checked the supply inventory for the morning run. She sat at the kitchen table until well past 10 with her notebook and her pen, working through every number she had, building the clearest picture she could of what Iron Creek's food operation had become. It was, she thought, looking at the final column, genuinely remarkable. Not perfect, not without its failures and its close calls and its days when everything went sideways, and she held it together through sheer obstinacy, but remarkable. She closed the notebook. She would need it to be more than remarkable in 2 weeks' time. She found out where Langford was staying through Rosa Escher, who heard it from her cousin the foreman, who heard it from the railroad's territorial superintendent during a routine camp inspection. Langford had arrived 4 days earlier than anyone expected, a Tuesday instead of a Friday, and had taken rooms at the Millhaven Hotel, which was the only hotel in Millhaven and not a particularly good one, but it was what was available. Savannah heard this on a Monday morning, standing beside her wagon at Camp 7 while the breakfast line was still moving. She finished serving the last of the men, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at Joseph. "How long has he been there?" she said. 2 days, maybe 3, Joseph said. Rosa's cousin wasn't sure. 2 or 3 days that Hearst had presumably already used. She folded the serving counter up, latched it, and made a decision in approximately 30 seconds. "Can you get the wagon back to the ranch without me?" Joseph looked at her. "I've been getting wagons places without you since before you arrived," he said, which was his version of yes. She untied her good horse from the back of the wagon, where she'd started keeping him for exactly this kind of contingency, and she rode to Millhaven. But the Millhaven Hotel had a dining room that served meals at specific hours and looked the other way between those hours when guests wanted something from the kitchen. It smelled of old grease and wood polish and the particular human accumulation of a building that had been housing travelers for 15 years. Savannah tied her horse at the post outside and went in without stopping to reconsider. The desk clerk told her Mr. Langford was not available. "Tell him Mrs. Weston Hale of Iron Creek Ranch is here regarding the vendor contract for the Western work camps," she said. "And tell him I have documentation he'll want to see before he makes any decisions." The clerk looked at her with the expression of someone who had not expected his Tuesday to include this. He went upstairs. He came back down. "He'll see you in 15 minutes, he said. The parlor. She sat in the parlor and did not fidget. She straightened her cuffs, reviewed what she intended to say, and looked at the painting on the wall opposite. A landscape of somewhere that was not Wyoming, someplace with hills that were too green, until the man came in. Victor Langford was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone like Foss at the bank. Settled, cautious. A man whose power expressed itself through procedure. Langford was younger, perhaps 42, with a lean face and the quick eyes of someone who processed information fast and found most of it disappointing. He was dressed well, but not showily, and he moved through the room the way men moved when they were accustomed to other people adjusting to their pace. He did not offer his hand. He sat down across from her and looked at her with a directness that was meant to be unsettling and might have been to someone else. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I understand you supply meals to several of our work camps." "4 camps currently," she said. "We've been in operation since October. I brought documentation." She placed her notebook on the table between them, the full version, with every column complete. He didn't touch it immediately. "I've already spoken with Mr. Hurst," he said. "I assumed you had," she said. "I'm not here to argue against Mr. Hurst. I'm here to show you what our operation has built and let you decide on the merits." He picked up the notebook. He was a faster reader than Foss. He moved through the pages with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly what numbers meant and didn't need them explained. She watched his face, and it gave very little away, which she respected even as it made her work harder to read him. "These service additions," he said without looking up, "the medical supplies, the translation work. We identified needs that weren't being met, and we met them," she said. "The camps run more smoothly when the men can understand their pay statements, and when minor injuries get cleaned properly instead of getting infected. That's not generosity. It's efficiency. Healthy workers who understand what they're being paid work better." He looked up. "You're making an argument for your operation in terms of railroad productivity." "I'm making an accurate description of what the data shows," she said. "You can interpret it however you like." Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a different kind of attention. He turned another page. She watched him reach the monthly income figures. She watched him reach the physician inspection report, which she had included deliberately near the back where it would land with more weight. He closed the notebook. He set it down. He laced his fingers on the table and looked at her in the particular way that meant he was about to say something that wasn't the same as what he was thinking. "The railroad is moving toward consolidated vendor contracts," he said. "One supplier for each operational corridor. It reduces liability, simplifies logistics, guarantees consistency." "I understand that," she said. "Hurst has been operating in this corridor for 2 years. He has existing infrastructure and an established relationship with the company. He has a single wagon and food that men eat because there's nothing else available," she said. "I have 2 wagons, a documented sanitation record, an expanded service roster, and 4 months of income growth. If consistency is what you're after, I'd suggest looking at which operation has actually been consistent." A pause. "You're very direct," he said. "I find it saves time," she said. Langford was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notebook again without picking it up. Then he stood, which meant the meeting was over, and Savannah stood too. "I'll be making my recommendation to the Chicago office by the end of the week," he said. "I'm reviewing several operations along this corridor." "Of course," she said. She picked up the notebook. "I left a copy of the key figures for your reference." She produced a folded page from inside the notebook. She had prepared 3 copies, anticipating exactly this, and placed it on the table. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Langford." She left without waiting for him to dismiss her. She rode back to the ranch in the thin April light, and she thought the meeting had gone as well as it could have gone, which was not the same as thinking it had gone well. The answer came 6 days later, and it was not what she had prepared herself for. A writer came from Millhaven on a Friday afternoon with a sealed letter addressed to Iron Creek Ranch, care of Mrs. S. Hale. She was in the yard when he arrived, and she took the letter and opened it right there, standing in the dirt with the wind pulling at her hair. It was brief. Langford regretted to inform her that following his review of the Western Corridor's vendor operations, the railroad would be awarding an exclusive supply contract for all work camps in the district to a single registered provider. After careful consideration of operational capacity and existing relationships, that contract had been awarded to Hurst Provisions. Effective immediately, Iron Creek Ranch's food wagons were prohibited from entering railroad camp premises. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and stood in the yard for a moment with her hands at her sides. Cal Dunnigan came around the corner of the barn with a saddle over one arm and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" "Go get Joseph," she said, "and tell Margaret to come up from the south road if she's back." She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and waited, taut. They came in one by one, Joseph first, then Margaret, then Cal, then Pete Rourke, who had not been summoned but arrived anyway with the instinct of a man who knows when a meeting is happening that he should be at. Weston came in last from the study and sat at the end of the table without being asked. Savannah put the letter in the center of the table. She let them read it. The silence that followed had different textures depending on who was in it. Pete's silence was angry. Cal's was disbelieving. Margaret's was the particular quiet of a woman who has been knocked back before and is already working out what happens next. Joseph said nothing, which meant he was thinking. "Hearst got to him," Pete said. "Langford's in his pocket. Has to be." "Maybe," Savannah said. "Or maybe Langford looked at the two operations and decided existing relationships were safer than new ones, and Hearst's 2 years looked more stable than our 4 months, whatever the numbers showed." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is what we do." "What can we do?" Cal said. "It's a railroad order. They own the camps." "They own the camps," Savannah said. "They don't own the roads." Everyone looked at her. "The camps are on railroad property," she said, "but the workers live their lives outside the camps too. They come to town on their days off. They have to. And there's a supply depot 2 miles off the main grade on county land where the independent haulers stop." She had been turning this over in her mind since she'd read the letter, and the shape of it was becoming clearer as she spoke. "We can't go to the camps, but we can go to the depot. We can be at the places where the men go when they're not at the camps." "That's a different kind of operation," Margaret said. "It is," Savannah agreed. "The volume will be lower. The income will drop." She didn't soften it, "but it keeps us running, and it keeps us in front of the same men. And there are families along the South Road and the Kinney Creek settlement who we've never served because we've been focused entirely on the camps." Pete rubbed the back of his neck. "The debt payment's due to Laramie in 6 weeks. I know when the payment is due," she said. "We can cover this month," Weston said quietly from the end of the table. Everyone looked at him. He had been so still that some of them had half forgotten he was there. "The account has enough for this month's payment. After that," he looked at Savannah, "after that we need to rebuild the income," she said, "and we will." She said it without performance. She said it because she believed it, and because the people around this table needed to hear it said plainly by someone who meant it. "It's going to be hard for a while. I'm not going to tell you otherwise, but we're not done." Margaret nodded once. Cal looked at his hands. Pete made a sound that was not agreement exactly, but was not disagreement either. Joseph said, "The supply depot idea is good. There's also the Kinney Creek mill workers. They eat badly too." "I know," Savannah said. "I've been thinking about them." The meeting broke up slowly, the way meetings do when people have what they need but don't quite want to leave. Savannah stayed at the table after the others had gone, with the letter in front of her and the notebook open beside it. Weston came back in from the doorway where he'd paused. "You all right?" he said. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." He stood there for a moment in the doorway, and she thought he was going to say something else, something in the direction of the thing that had been building slowly between them for months, the thing neither of them had named. But he didn't. He just nodded once and went back to the study. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and began writing. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her time at Iron Creek Ranch, harder even than the first months when she'd been learning everything from nothing. Those months had been difficult in a way that had energy in it, the difficulty of building, which always has a kind of forward momentum. This was the difficulty of holding on, which was a different animal entirely, and meaner. The supply depot worked, partially. Men came, more than she'd expected on the first day because word travels fast in a community where not much changes, and she had cultivated enough goodwill over 4 months that people were willing to walk an extra mile to buy from her. But the numbers were nowhere near what the camp contract had been producing. She cut costs where she could without cutting quality. Quality was the only advantage she had, and compromising it would be the same as surrendering. And she stretched supplies and renegotiated terms with 2 of her vendors in Laramie and Millhaven. The Kinney Creek settlement turned out to be more promising than she'd anticipated. It was a scattered community of mill workers and their families, about 60 people in total, living along a creek road 3 miles south of the main wagon route. They had a company store that charged prices with the calm brutality of a monopoly and sold food that traveled badly and arrived in poor condition. Savannah started going there twice a week with fresh bread, cooked beans, salt meat, and vegetables when she could get them, and charging 20 cents a meal, which was 10 cents less than she'd charged the railroad camps and more than covered her costs. The mill families bought everything she brought, every time. The children in particular watched the wagon arrive with an expression she recognized from the rail workers, the look of people who have been eating badly and know it. She started adding a small portion of extra food to every order, never announced and never exactly the same thing twice, just whatever she had that was close to running out and would otherwise go to waste. She told herself this was practical. It cleared her inventory. And it was, but it was also not only that. Rosa Escher came with her on Thursdays and helped the families with the company store's paperwork, which was written in English and included terms that were not explained and were not in the workers' favor. Rosa was 23 and had a quality of focused indignation about injustice that Savannah found genuinely useful as well as personally satisfying to be around. Margaret kept the depot running on the days Savannah was at Kinney Creek, and on those days Margaret also drove out to a third location, a small mining operation 8 miles north that Savannah had identified on a map and sent Margaret to scout, which Margaret had done with the pragmatic thoroughness of a woman who has learned that the difference between surviving and not surviving is often just attention to the task in front of you. The mining operation wanted food. Of course it did. There were 30 men in the hills eating whatever the camp cook managed to put together, which was apparently not much. So the routes expanded even as the income contracted, and Savannah kept 2 separate accounting columns, one for what they were making, one for what they had been making before the letter. And she looked at the gap between those columns every evening and let it motivate her without letting it panic her, which was a harder discipline than it sounded. It was Pete Rourke who brought her the news about Langford on a Thursday evening near the end of April. Pete had gone into Millhaven for supplies and come back with his jaw set in a way that meant he'd heard something and was deciding how to say it. "Langford's still in town," he said, setting the supply bags on the kitchen floor. "He's been there 2 weeks now instead of the one he planned." Savannah looked up from the stove. "Why?" "Hearst," Pete said. "Word is Hearst's operation is having trouble. Men at Camp 7 walked off the breakfast line 2 days running because the food was bad. Not just bad, one man got sick. Stomach thing, nothing serious, but it scared the rest of them, and the foreman reported it up the line." He sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. "Langford is dealing with a mess that didn't exist when your wagons were running." Savannah turned back to the stove. She stirred what was on it. She kept her voice entirely level. "Is the man who got sick all right?" "Seems to be. Recovered fast." "Good." She meant it. The man's health mattered regardless of what his illness meant for her situation. She thought about what Pete had told her for the rest of that evening. She thought about it through supper and through the dishes and through her accounting review at the kitchen table. She turned it over from every direction. The problem with going back to Langford directly was that she had already made her case, and he had decided against her. Coming back immediately after Hearst stumbled would look opportunistic in a way that might put him on the defensive, and a man on the defensive stops listening. She needed a different approach. She needed someone else to make the argument. She thought about Brower, the German foreman at Camp 7, who had ordered 40 meals and paid in advance after the physician inspection. She thought about what it would mean to him to have his breakfast line walking off again. She found out where Brower went on his days off. She found out through Rosa, who found out through her cousin, which was the same chain that had given her Langford's hotel 2 months ago. Brower went to the Millhaven Tavern on Sundays after the noon meal, and he sat at the same table and drank 1 beer slowly and read a German-language newspaper he had mailed to him from Denver. Savannah did not go to the tavern. She wrote Brower a letter. She kept it brief and practical because brevity and practicality were, she had come to understand, the language Brower most naturally spoke. She described what Iron Creek could offer, the service record, the physician documentation, the expanded capacity. She told him she was not asking him to do anything on her behalf. She was simply making sure he had complete information, and what he did with it was his own business. She sent it with Rosa's cousin. 3 days later, Brower filed a formal operational complaint with the railroad's territorial superintendent. The complaint cited food quality failures, one illness incident, and worker productivity loss resulting from inadequate provisioning. It was signed by Brower and countersigned by the foreman of Camp 4 and Ridgeline, both of whom had apparently decided they had enough reason to add their names. She heard about it from Pete, who heard about it from the land agent, who heard it from the telegraph office. She hadn't asked for that. She had written to one man, and 3 had acted. That was not something she'd planned. It was something she'd made possible, and the distinction mattered to her. The conversation with Langford happened on a Wednesday. She didn't go to him this time. He came to her. She was at the supply depot, midway through the morning service, when a man on a good horse rode up and dismounted and turned out to be Victor Langford, which was not what she had expected. He was not in the polished clothing of their hotel meeting. He was in a working coat and trail dust, and he looked like a man who had been riding and thinking and arrived somewhere he wasn't entirely sure about. She didn't stop serving. There were 12 men in line, and they were hungry, and they had come here specifically because of what had happened at the camps, and their needs did not pause for railroad executives. Langford stood back and watched her work for several minutes. She was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, without being able to do much about it, so you focus on what you can control. When the line cleared, she turned to face him. "Mr. Langford," she said. "Mrs. Hale." He looked at the wagon, at the men eating nearby, at the road and the depot and the basic practical machinery of what she'd built. "You're still running." "I'm still running," she agreed. "The depot isn't on railroad property." "No," she said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man sorting through several things he could say and discarding most of them. "I've been receiving complaints," he said. "I heard. Not just from the foreman, from the Chicago office." He said this with the particular tone of a man for whom Chicago represented a force above his own authority. "Productivity numbers are down at 3 camps since the vendor change." Savannah said nothing. She waited. "I may have made an error in judgment," he said. He did not say it easily. It had the quality of something expensive, the way an honest admission costs a man like that more than most things. "I think you made the decision that looked most stable at the time," she said. "I don't think it was corrupt. I think Hearst presented his existing operation as more reliable than it turned out to be." He looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at the wagon again, at the insulated boxes she'd rebuilt 3 times, at the serving counter with its folding hinges that she and Eli had fitted together on a November afternoon when the wind was bad and her fingers were numb and the whole idea had felt genuinely impossible. "If I were to revisit the contract arrangement," he said, "I would need assurance of capacity, more camps, not fewer. The Chicago office wants the whole corridor consolidated under one reliable provider." "The whole corridor," she said. "Every camp between the first grade marker and the western terminus. That's 11 camps. Double what you were serving." 11 camps. She ran the numbers in her head fast and incomplete the way she always did the first pass. Supply volume, wagon capacity, staffing, routes. "That's a significant expansion," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is. I'd need time to scale appropriately. I won't sign a contract I can't honor." She met his eyes. "That's not negotiating. That's a condition." "How much time?" 3 weeks minimum to get the operation in position. I'll need a signed letter of intent from the railroad before I commit the resources." He studied her. The quick eyes moved over her face and the wagon and the men eating nearby and came back to her. "Hearst's contract would need to be unwound," he said. "That's your business," she said. "Not mine." A pause. "I'll have my office send a letter of intent to Iron Creek Ranch by end of week," he said. She nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Langford." He mounted his horse and rode back toward Millhaven. She stood at the serving counter for a moment after he was gone. Margaret was watching her from the other end of the wagon with her arms crossed and an expression that was waiting. "Well?" Margaret said. "Start thinking about a 3rd wagon," Savannah said. Margaret uncrossed her arms. She turned and looked at the road Langford had gone down, then back at Savannah. "You're not celebrating." "Not yet," Savannah said. "I celebrate when the letter comes." She picked up the serving ladle. "Right now there's still food to serve." There was a man at the back of the depot who had arrived during the conversation with Langford and had been waiting with the particular patience of someone who has learned that waiting is just part of the day. He was a mill worker from Kinney Creek. She recognized him. A broad-shouldered man named Henrik, who always ordered extra bread for his wife and 3 daughters. She loaded his plate generously and handed it across the counter. "Busy morning?" he said. "Getting busier," she said. He nodded, picked up his plate, and went to find somewhere to sit, and Savannah turned to the next person in line. The letter of intent arrived on Friday, as Langford had said it would. She read it at the kitchen table with Weston sitting across from her, and this time she let him see her face while she read it, because she was not alone in this anymore and hadn't been for some time, and it seemed right to let that show. When she set it down, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just for a moment. His hand was rough and warm and said the thing he didn't have the words for yet. She left her hand there. 3 weeks, she said. We have 3 weeks to build something we've never built before. Tell me what you need, he said. She looked at him, not at the November eyes or the fence post jaw or the careful distance he had kept since October. She looked at the man underneath all of that, the one who had said 1 wagon when he could have said nothing, who had sat beside her in a bank and let her do the talking because he understood she was better at it, who had come back to the kitchen doorway on the night the letter came and asked if she was all right. "I'll make you a list," she said. His mouth did the thing it almost never did, the brief, surprised shape that was the closest he came to a smile. "You always do," he said. The list she made Weston was 3 pages long. She wrote it that same Friday night after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter of intent folded open beside her notebook, working through every category she could think of in the order of urgency. Wagons first. They needed a 3rd and possibly a 4th, and the question was not whether they could find them, but whether they could find ones that were sound enough to convert in 3 weeks without the conversion itself becoming the problem. Then staffing, which was the harder calculation, because a wagon was a thing you could fix with lumber and hardware, but a person who could cook reliably for 40 hungry men in a moving kitchen in all weather was a different kind of resource entirely. Then supply chains. At 11 camps, their current vendor arrangements in Millhaven and Laramie would not hold. They would need volume commitments that their existing suppliers might not be able to meet, which meant finding additional suppliers, which meant Weston making trips she hadn't yet asked him to make. She gave him the list Saturday morning. He read all 3 pages without speaking. When he finished, he looked up at her and said, "Fletcher in Millhaven has 2 wagons. Neither one is what you'd want, but one of them is workable." "I know about the Fletcher wagons," she said. "I priced them out in January. There's also the Dunbar outfit on the North Road. They've been hauling freight, but Dunbar's been talking about getting out of it. His wagon is in better shape." She hadn't known about Dunbar. She wrote it down. "Can you go see him Monday?" "I'll go today," Weston said. He was out the door inside 20 minutes. She watched him ride out from the kitchen window and thought, not for the first time, that the man she had married on paper in October was not the same man who was riding out now. Or maybe he was the same man, and she had simply learned to read him correctly. Either way, the difference was significant. The 3 weeks that followed were the most sustained effort Savannah had ever made toward anything. She had thought the early months of building the operation had been hard work. They had been. But those months had the advantage of small scale. 2 wagons, a handful of camps, a team of people she could speak to directly every day. Scaling to 11 camps in 3 weeks was a different category of problem. It was the kind of problem that, if she thought about it whole all at once, became too large to move. So she refused to think about it whole. She broke it into its pieces, and she worked the pieces in order, and she trusted that the pieces would eventually become the whole she needed. Weston bought the Dunbar wagon and talked Fletcher down on the price of the second one. Both needed work. The Dunbar wagon had a broken axle housing that required a blacksmith in 2 days, and the Fletcher wagon's bed was compromised by rot in 2 planks that she and Eli pulled out and replaced themselves. Eli had grown into his limbs somewhat over the winter. He worked with a focused competence that made her glad she'd paid him attention when he was still mostly awkward and young. Margaret took on the role of operations manager without being asked and without making a point of it. She simply began doing it, coordinating which wagon went where, tracking supply inventory across all 4 vehicles, making sure nobody ended up at the same camp on the same day, managing the schedules with a handwritten system she developed herself on a piece of brown paper tacked to the kitchen wall. It was not elegant, but it worked, and working was the only standard that mattered. Rosa brought in her cousin and two of his friends as additional drivers. One of the friends was a young Italian named Marco, who spoke almost no English but could handle a team in bad conditions better than anyone Savannah had seen, and who turned out to have strong opinions about bread that aligned almost exactly with her own. She put him to work on the morning baking rotation, and within a week the bread coming out of Iron Creek's kitchen was better than it had been, which she had not expected. Cal and Trace were driving full-time now. Dutch, who had remained largely on the periphery since the operation began, came to Savannah one morning and said, without looking directly at her, that he'd heard they needed another driver, and he was available. She looked at him for a moment, thinking of the conversation she'd heard through the window in those early months, the voice saying it's not ranch work. And then she said the wage and the schedule, and he said fine, and that was that. People changed when circumstances changed. Sometimes they just needed the circumstances to change first. The supply problem was harder than the wagon problem. Her existing vendors in Millhaven could not supply the volume she needed at 11 camps. She knew this before she asked them, but she asked anyway because occasionally people surprised her. They did not surprise her. Millhaven's general store could provide perhaps 60% of what she needed, and the rest had to come from Laramie, which meant a longer and more expensive supply run twice a week. Weston made the Laramie runs himself, leaving before dawn on Tuesdays and Fridays and coming back late, and he did not complain about this once. She heard about the trips not from him but from Pete, who had started to develop what she could only describe as a quiet pride in the whole operation, as if the ranch's revival had become something he'd been involved in from the beginning, which, in a way, he had, even if his involvement had looked like skepticism for the first 3 months. The nights were short. She was up at 4 most mornings, sometimes 3:30, working through the day's preparation before Joseph arrived at 5 to hitch the first team. There were nights when she was so tired that she sat at the kitchen table after supper and fell asleep in her chair and woke up an hour later with the lamp still burning and her cheek pressed against the open notebook. She would straighten up and drink cold coffee and go to bed and set herself to wake up at 4 and do it again. She did not talk about being tired. There was no point in talking about it. 9 days into the 3 weeks, something went wrong. It was not the thing she had been most afraid of. Not a supply failure or a wagon breakdown or one of the drivers getting sick. It was something she hadn't put on any list because it had not occurred to her to worry about it. Brower sent a message through Rosa's cousin. The message said that Victor Langford had been called back to Chicago for a meeting with the railroad's executive board. The Western Corridor contract was under review. Until the review was complete, all vendor arrangements were suspended pending confirmation. Savannah read the message twice. Then she set it down on the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and stayed very still for a moment, pending confirmation. That phrase had a way of meaning anything. It could mean a week. It could mean the board reviewed the situation and decided they didn't want to change anything, which would mean Hearst's original contract was reinstated and her 3 weeks of work became a great deal of wasted money and effort. She did not say any of this out loud. She folded the message and put it in her notebook. Margaret had been in the room when she read it. "What does that mean for us?" Margaret asked. "It means we keep working," Savannah said. "We don't stop preparing. If the confirmation comes through, we need to be ready, and if it doesn't come through..." She stopped. Started again. "If it doesn't, we're no worse positioned than we were before Langford came to the depot. We have the supply routes and the Kinney Creek settlement and the mining camp. We keep building those. And the money we've spent on the wagons is spent," Savannah said. "We don't get it back by stopping." Margaret looked at her steadily. Margaret had 3 children and had buried a husband and had figured out how to keep feeding those children on almost nothing, and she understood better than most people the specific arithmetic of going forward when going forward was the only choice you actually had. "All right," Margaret said. "What's on the schedule for tomorrow?" She told Weston that evening. She told him plainly, without softening it, because he needed to know, and because softening things was a kind of disrespect she had no interest in offering him. He sat at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting, which was what he always did, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much have we spent?" he said. She told him the figure. He absorbed this. And if the contract doesn't come through, we can still service the accounts we built during the exclusion period. The mining camp, Kinney Creek, the depot. It's significantly less than the railroad camps, but it keeps the operation viable. She looked at her hands on the table. The bank payment for May is covered. June is where it gets difficult. Then we make June work, he said. It might not be that simple. I know it's not simple, he said. I said we'd make it work, not that it'd be simple. He said it without irritation, just plainly, the way she said most things. She recognized the tone because it was one she used herself. She looked at him. You're not angry. What would that help, he said. It was a thing she might have said herself. She felt something settle in her chest that was not quite comfort and not quite relief, something closer to recognition. The review could take 2 weeks, she said. Maybe more. Then we wait 2 weeks. He pushed back from the table. I'm going to check on the Dunbar wagon's axle before it gets dark. Eli said the housing repair's holding, but I want to look at it myself. He was halfway to the door when she said his name. He stopped. Thank you, she said. She said it the way she'd said it before, not politely, but specifically, with the full weight of what she meant by it. He turned and looked at her for a moment from the doorway. The light was going outside, the last of the April afternoon dropping behind the ridge, and in the dimming kitchen he looked like the man she had started to understand somewhere around December and had not stopped understanding since. You'd do the same, he said. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, I would. He nodded once and went out to check the wagon. 12 days passed. The operation continued. Not at the railroad camps, they were still excluded, technically, pending the Chicago Review, but everywhere else. Kinney Creek twice a week, the mining camp on Tuesdays, the supply depot on the days they couldn't reach the others. Margaret had established a new route along the South Road that hit 3 small homestead clusters that had never been served before, farm families and a sheep grazing operation and a way station for freight haulers, and this route was turning a modest but real profit. Savannah kept accounting columns for all of it. She was meticulous about this not because she enjoyed it. She had never particularly enjoyed the mechanics of accounting, but because the numbers were the only honest record of reality, and reality was the only thing worth working with. On the 9th day of waiting, Hearst came to find her. She did not know he was coming until he was there, which was itself a kind of message. He had not sent word ahead because sending word ahead would have given her time to prepare, and he did not want her to prepare. He arrived at the supply depot on a Tuesday morning, coming from the direction of Millhaven on a horse that cost considerably more than anything Savannah owned, and he was not alone. He had a man with him who stood slightly behind and to the right, and had the particular quality of someone who was there to be a physical fact rather than a participant in the conversation. Hearst was, as Cal had described him, stocky and red-mustached. He was better dressed than she expected, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had won most of his fights and intended to win this one. He waited until the men at the depot had been served and moved away before he approached the wagon. She watched him come, and she kept her face neutral and her hands occupied. She was reorganizing the supply boxes, which needed doing, because she wanted him to understand that his arrival was not the largest thing happening in her morning. Mrs. Hale, he said. Mr. Hearst, she said. She didn't stop what she was doing. I'd like to speak with you. You're speaking, she said. He absorbed this without visible reaction. He had done this before, navigated difficult conversations, which meant he knew how to wait out a provocation. She did not particularly want to provoke him. She just wasn't willing to perform deference she didn't feel. I understand the Chicago board is reviewing Langford's contract arrangements, he said. I know as much as you do about what's happening in Chicago, she said. I doubt that, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not threatening exactly, but with the weight of implication. I've operated in this territory for 2 years. I have relationships with people in that office you've never met. She looked at him directly for the first time since he'd approached. What is it you want, Mr. Hearst? He met her eyes. His were pale brown and entirely steady. I'm prepared to offer you a buyout, a fair one. Your wagons, your routes, your supplier relationships. I'll take the whole operation and pay you a price that covers what you've invested, plus a reasonable return. You'd be done with this. Your ranch is saved, your debts are covered. She kept her face still. She was running numbers in her head. Not his offer, which she hadn't heard yet, but the shape of why he was making it. A man with connections in Chicago who expected to win didn't come in person to a roadside depot to offer a buyout. He sent a letter, or he sent the man standing slightly behind him. Coming himself meant something. "What's the figure?" she said. He told her. She had expected it to be low. It was lower than she'd expected. It was not a fair offer. It was the offer of a man who assumed she was frightened enough to take it. "That doesn't cover the wagons," she said. "It covers the wagons at current market value." Current market value for converted food service wagons isn't what you'd pay for a raw wagon at auction, she said. "You know that. I built those conversions. The equipment and the work aren't in your number." "I can go up by 10%, he said. "You'd need to go up by 40% to be in the range of fair," she said. "And even then, I'd have to think about it carefully, because what we've built here isn't only wagons. It's relationships with camp foremen and mill families and mining operations that took months to develop and aren't transferable in the way physical property is transferable." Hearst looked at her for a long moment. "The review might not go your way," he said. "Langford's position is uncertain in Chicago. If a different executive takes over the Western Corridor decision, they'll likely default to existing contracts. My contract." "That's possible," she said. "If that happens, you'll have 4 wagons and no camps to serve." "I'll have 4 wagons and the accounts I've built independently," she said. "Which are fewer than the camps, yes, but they're accounts nobody gave me and nobody can take away through administrative review." He studied her. She thought she saw something shift in his expression. Not respect exactly, but a reassessment. The remeasuring of an obstacle he had expected to be smaller. "My offer stands for 48 hours, he said. "Then it'll expire in 48 hours, she said. She turned back to the supply boxes. "I have work to do, Mr. Hearst." He left. The man behind him followed without having said a word. Margaret appeared from around the far side of the wagon, where she had been listening without pretending not to. 40% still wouldn't have been enough, she said. "No," Savannah said, "it wouldn't." "What if the review goes against us?" Savannah lifted a box and set it in its place. "Then we figure out what comes next from where we actually are, not from where we're afraid we might be." Margaret said nothing for a moment, then, "I need to recount the bean supply. We're lower than the inventory says." "I know," Savannah said. "Count it and let me know what's actually there." Quote, "The telegram from Chicago came on a Thursday afternoon, 16 days after Langford had been called back. It was addressed to Iron Creek Ranch, and the ranch hand who collected it from the telegraph office in Millhaven rode hard to get it there before dark. Savannah was in the kitchen when she heard the horse come in fast, and she knew, in the particular way you know things that are preceded by their own weight, that this was it. She took the telegram at the door. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. Weston came in from the study. He stood in the doorway and waited. She read it once. She read it again. She set it on the table and smoothed it with one hand. "The board confirmed Langford's recommendation," she said. "Iron Creek Ranch is awarded the exclusive provisioning contract for all 11 camps on the Western Corridor." She paused. "The contract term is 18 months with an option to extend." Weston said nothing. He came to the table and picked up the telegram and read it himself, which she expected him to do. She sat with her hands in her lap and let herself feel it, the relief and the exhaustion and the complicated thing underneath both of them that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite disbelief. It was something closer to vindication, which she found was quieter than she had expected. 18 months, Weston said. "With extension," she said. "If we perform." "You'll perform," he said. It was not flattery. It was a plain statement of what he believed, and she heard the difference. "We'll perform," she said, correcting him deliberately. "This isn't just mine." He looked at her across the table. The telegram was in his hand and the lamp was burning between them, and outside the Wyoming spring was doing what it did. Uncertain, variable, promising things it might or might not keep. "We'll need to formalize the partnership," she said. "On paper, equal share in the food operation. I want it in writing, Weston, not because I don't trust you, but because—" She stopped. "Because a woman who spent 4 years as a bookkeeper's assistant knows that verbal agreements are only worth the air they're set in," he finished. "Yes," she said. "I'll get the lawyer from Laramie next week," he said. She nodded. She looked at the telegram again. 18 months. 11 camps. The possibility of extension beyond that if they did what she knew they were capable of doing. She thought about Hurst's 48-hour offer, which had expired 2 days ago. She thought about Langford on his horse at the depot, looking at the wagon she'd built from a bad idea and determination. She thought about Aldrich Foss at the bank desk in Laramie, turning her notebook over in his hands with the air of a man being surprised against his will. She thought about October and the supply wagon on a frozen road, and a line of hungry men who turned into customers because she had paid attention to what they needed. I should tell Margaret, she said. In the morning, Weston said. Tonight, sit down. She looked at him. You've been up since 4, he said. Every day for 3 weeks. Sit down. She sat. He went to the kitchen shelf and came back with 2 cups of coffee, the evening pot, which was strong enough to float a nail, and set one in front of her and sat down across from her with his own. The table between them was marked with the rings of 100 coffee cups and the faint indentations where her pen had pressed too hard through pages of the notebook, and she had been sitting at this table for 7 months, working through problems that had no guarantee of solving. They drank their coffee in silence, which was not empty silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had gotten somewhere they hadn't been sure they'd reach, and who were willing to stay in that moment a little while before they started talking about what came next. There would be plenty to talk about. Tomorrow, Savannah would tell Margaret. She would call Joseph and Cal and Trace and Dutch and Eli and Rosa and Marco and the cousin and everyone else who had given their labor and their trust to something that had looked in various moments like it was going to fail. She would pull out the notebook and draw up the expansion schedule. She would write to the vendor in Laramie about volume commitments, and she would map the 11 camps on the back of a supply invoice and start working out the route logistics. She would do all of that tomorrow. Tonight she drank her coffee and listened to the Wyoming wind work its way around the house, and she let herself acknowledge privately and without fanfare that she had built something real, not perfect, not without its failures and its near misses and its nights when she had been so tired and so uncertain that the doubt had felt like a physical weight, but real. And real was the only thing worth building. Across the table, Weston set his cup down and looked at her with the November eyes that were somehow less unreadable than they had been in October. Not because he had changed exactly, because she had learned to read what was actually there. Good work, Mrs. Hale, he said. The same words he had said every evening since October, but not the same at all in the way he said them. She held his gaze. Good work, Mr. Hale, she said. Outside, Iron Creek Ranch settled into its spring night, the barn with its repaired east roof, the bunkhouse full of men who had stayed because they believed in something worth staying for, the 4 wagons in the yard waiting for morning. The telegram sat on the table between them. 18 months, 11 camps, a future that had not been imaginable 7 months ago, when a woman arrived on a frozen road expecting to cook meals and found instead a problem that needed solving. She had solved it. They both had. The lawyer from Laramie arrived on a Tuesday in early May, a thin man named Caldwell, who carried his briefcase like it contained something fragile and asked 3 times for directions to the ranch from Mill Haven, despite having been given written directions in advance. He sat at the kitchen table where Savannah had done every piece of accounting for the past 7 months and drew up the partnership agreement while she and Weston sat on either side of him and read every line before they agreed to it. Caldwell had clearly expected the husband to do most of the reading. He kept directing his explanations toward Weston, who kept redirecting them toward Savannah with a slight tilt of his head that meant she's the one you need to satisfy. By the 3rd page, Caldwell had adjusted and was speaking to them both equally, which was all she had wanted. The agreement was straightforward. Equal partnership in the Iron Creek food operation, which was formally named in the document as Iron Creek Provisions. Revenue split equally after operating expenses. Decisions requiring both signatures above a threshold amount they had agreed on the night before. Either partner could propose expansion, both had to approve it. She signed her name in full, Savannah Ann Hale. The ink was still wet when Weston signed beside her. Caldwell blotted the page, gathered his papers, and accepted a cup of coffee and a thick slice of bread with butter before he made the drive back to Laramie. He ate it at the table with the appreciation of a man who had been eating hotel food for 2 days and knew the difference. Good bread, he said. It's Marco's, Savannah said. He has opinions about bread. They're correct opinions, Caldwell said. She walked him to his buggy and came back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the signed copy of the agreement on the table. Then she put it in the notebook, in the same section as the telegram and the bank extension letter and the physician inspection report, the documentary history of the past 7 months, and went to plan the week's routes. May was the hardest month operationally and the best one financially, and these two facts coexisted without resolving into anything simple. Running 11 camps simultaneously required a precision of coordination that pushed every system she had built to its limit. The brown paper schedule Margaret had tacked to the kitchen wall was replaced, then replaced again, as routes shifted and camp populations changed, and the railroad's own schedule pushed and pulled at the work sites in ways that affected meal timing. There were mornings when 2 wagons were needed at the same location at overlapping times because the shift changes had been moved without notice, and afternoons when a camp sent word that half the crew was relocating and the food that had been prepared for 50 men needed to stretch to serve 30 without looking like it had been cut. Savannah handled these problems the way she handled all problems, by looking at them directly and without the luxury of panic. Panic was expensive. It cost time, and it cost the confidence of the people working around you, and she could not afford either. Cal Dunnigan, who had come a long way from the man leaning on a fence, saying it's not ranch work, turned out to have a genuine talent for route logistics that nobody, including Cal, had known about. He could look at the day's schedule and identify conflicts that weren't obvious until you'd mapped the geography. And he started doing this every morning without being asked, arriving early, studying the schedule on the wall, marking adjustments in pencil before the first team was hitched. She gave him a title, Operations Coordinator. He pretended the title didn't matter to him. He told every new driver about it within the first hour. Marco had expanded his bread operation to the point where the ranch's kitchen ran in 2 shifts. He baked from 3 in the morning until 6, when Savannah took over for the hot meal preparation. His bread had developed a small but vocal following among the Polish workers at Camp 3, who had opinions about bread that were even more specific than his own, and the resulting conversations, conducted partly in Polish, partly in Italian, partly in a kind of expressive gesture language they'd developed between them, produced 2 new recipes that made it into the regular rotation. It was not a smooth operation. Smoothness was not something Savannah had ever promised anyone, including herself. There were equipment failures and supply shortages, and one genuinely terrible week in late May when the water barrel on the 4th wagon developed a slow leak that wasn't discovered until 2 days of food had been prepared with water that had partially turned and everything had to be thrown out and remade, and she lost $300 in one afternoon and sat in the barn for 20 minutes by herself, feeling the full weight of it before she stood up and went back to the kitchen. She didn't tell Weston about the 20 minutes in the barn. Some things were private, but she told him about the loss because he had a right to know and because the accounting required it. He looked at the figure she'd written down. "Can we absorb it?" "Yes," she said. "It'll come off June's margin." "What do we do about the barrel?" "I already ordered a new one, different supplier, better construction." She had spent part of those 20 minutes in the barn identifying exactly what had failed and exactly what she would replace it with. Grief, in her experience, was most useful when it was converted into specific improvement. He nodded. "All right." That was all. No recrimination, no inventory of what she could have done differently. Just all right, and the implicit understanding that they were moving forward. She found, over the weeks of May, that this was what partnership actually felt like. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of someone who treated difficulty as a shared fact rather than a personal failure. The news about Hearst reached Iron Creek in early June, through the usual channels. Pete heard it from the land agent, who heard it from someone at the Millhaven Telegraph Office, which had become the de facto clearinghouse for information about everything that mattered in that part of Wyoming. Hearst's contract had not only been terminated, he was under investigation by the railroad's Internal Affairs Office for misrepresenting his operational capacity in the original contract application. The physician incident at Camp 7, the sick worker, the walking off of the breakfast line, had been combined with 2 earlier complaints that Savannah hadn't known about, complaints that Hearst had apparently managed to suppress through his purchasing office connection. That connection, a man named Tilford, had been removed from his position in Chicago as part of the same review that had confirmed Langford's recommendation for Iron Creek. Savannah heard all of this and said very little. Pete was watching her face when he delivered the news, looking for satisfaction, she thought, or vindication, the kind of reaction that made a good story to tell in the bunkhouse. She didn't give it to him, not because she didn't feel it, but because the feeling was more complicated than a clear reaction. She had not done any of this to Hearst. She had defended herself, protected her operation, built something better than what he was offering. His situation was the result of his own choices and his own shortcuts and his own decision to try to destroy what she was building rather than improve what he had. She hadn't set out to ruin him. She had set out to survive. The difference mattered, even if the outcome looked similar from the outside. "What happened to Langford?" she asked Pete. "He's still with the railroad, got reassigned to the Eastern Division." Pete paused. "Word is he's doing well there." She nodded. Langford had made an error in judgment, admitted it, and corrected it. That was a different category of behavior than Hearst's, and it deserved a different outcome. "Thanks, Pete," she said. "You're not—" He gestured vaguely. "Not what?" "I don't know. Happy about it?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm glad the camps have reliable food," she said, "and I'm glad the men who reported the problems got heard. The rest of it—" She looked out at the yard. "I don't have a lot of feeling about Hearst specifically. I was too busy building something to spend much time thinking about him." Pete absorbed this. "The hands were talking last night," he said, "about how much has changed." "What did they say?" "Different things." He looked at his hat, which he was turning in his hands. "Dutch said he didn't think it would work, back at the start. He wanted you to know he thinks differently now." She looked at him. "Dutch said that?" "He said it to Cal. Cal told me." Pete put his hat back on. "Seemed like something you should hear." She thought about Dutch showing up at her door asking for driving work, the slight downward angle of his eyes, the way he'd said fine and meant more than fine. People didn't always announce their changes. Sometimes they just showed up differently. "Tell him I heard it," she said, "and tell him he's doing good work." Bet. The banknote was settled in full on a Friday in June, 2 months ahead of the schedule she had proposed to Foss in February. She made the trip to Laramie herself, with the payment and the final accounting in a leather case she'd bought specifically for this purpose. Foss met her in the same office, at the same desk, and he looked at the documentation with the same careful expression he'd had in February, but this time the numbers were going the other way. "This is the full balance," he said. "Plus the final month's interest," she said. "I didn't want any ambiguity." He looked at the figures for a moment. Then he produced the relevant document, stamped it, signed it, and slid it across the desk. Iron Creek Ranch's debt to the Laramie Bank was cleared. She took the document and put it in the leather case beside her notebook. "Mrs. Hale," Foss said as she stood to leave. She looked at him. "When you came in February," he said, "I was not entirely—" He stopped. Restarted. "I took your proposal to the board because the numbers were sound, but I wasn't sure the numbers would hold." "I know," she said. "You were right, and I was cautious," he said. He said it the way men like him said things that cost them, carefully and with the awareness of what the admission meant. "I wanted to say that plainly." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad man. He was a careful man in a profession that rewarded caution and occasionally punished it too. "You gave us the extension," she said. "That's what mattered." She left the bank and stood outside in the Laramie street for a moment, the leather case in her hand, the Wyoming summer doing what summer did, expansive and bright and entirely indifferent to the things that had happened under it. She had come to Wyoming 9 months ago on a buckboard in frozen mud, with her hands folded in her lap like a woman attending her own trial. The woman standing in this street in June was the same woman in every fact. Same hands, same practical nature, same tendency to look at a situation and see the problem that needed solving rather than the shape someone else had decided it should have. But she was not the same in the way that mattered. She understood, standing there, that the change was not about what she had built. It was about what she had found out she was capable of building. Those were different things. The operation could fail, theoretically. Supply chains broke. Markets shifted. A bad enough winter could set everything back. But the knowledge of what she could do did not disappear with the things she had done. It stayed. It became part of the equipment she moved through the world with. Nobody could take a ledger away from a woman who had already proved she could read one. She got in the buggy and drove back to Iron Creek. The summer moved in the way summers do when the work is real and the days are long. The 11 camps ran. The routes refined themselves through repetition into something approaching efficiency. New workers came to the corridor as the railroad pushed west and became customers within their first week, because the foreman told them where the wagon stopped and the food was worth the walk. Margaret's South Road route had expanded to include 2 additional homestead clusters, and a way station that served as an informal community gathering point on Saturday afternoons, where Savannah had started sending extra bread, and whatever was close to surplus, because it turned out that feeding people in the way a community feeds people, without transaction at the center of it, produced a kind of goodwill that money couldn't manufacture. This was not strategic, it was just the right thing to do, and Savannah had come to trust that the right thing and the practical thing were more often aligned than people gave credit for, provided you were willing to be patient about when the alignment showed up. Rosa Escher, who had started as a translator 2 days a week, had by July become indispensable to the operation in ways that extended well beyond language. She understood the workers' communities in a way that Savannah, despite her attention and her genuine respect for the people she served, could not fully access from the outside. Rosa knew when a family was struggling before they said anything. She knew which foremen were trustworthy and which ones made promises they didn't keep. She knew the rhythms of a labor camp in the way you know the rhythms of a place you have spent real time in, and this knowledge was worth more than Savannah had adequately compensated her for. Savannah corrected this in July. She gave Rosa a title, Community Liaison, which was a real description of a real function, and increased her pay by 30% and told her plainly why. Rosa looked at the number for a moment and then said, "I thought you'd wait until you couldn't get away without it." "I thought about waiting," Savannah said honestly. "Then I decided not to." Rosa pocketed the figure and went back to work. And that was that. Which was exactly how Savannah preferred these things to go. The barn's east roof was fully repaired in August. Weston hired a proper carpenter from Millhaven and stood in the yard supervising with the focused attention of a man who had been looking at that sag for 2 years and was not prepared to accept anything less than correct. The cattle herd was slowly rebuilding, not dramatically, not in the way of a story that needed a triumphant scene, but in the ordinary way of a ranching operation that had stabilized its finances and could now make decisions based on what made sense rather than what was cheapest. Weston bought 12 head in June and 20 more in August, good stock, and the pasture was being managed properly for the first time in 3 years because there was money to maintain the fences and the water access without choosing between them. Pete Rourke had settled into something that looked from the outside like contentment, which Pete would have hotly denied if anyone said it directly. But he stopped arriving at breakfast with the tightness around his eyes that Savannah had noticed in those early months, the look of a man who isn't sure the floor will hold, and started arriving instead with the unhurried manner of someone who expects the day to be workable. That was contentment in Pete's particular dialect. Eli turned 18 in July, and Savannah gave him a formal driver's position with a driver's wage, and he stood in the kitchen doorway holding the written offer and read it twice and then said, with the precise economy of someone trying hard not to show too much, "Thank you, Mrs. Hale." She said he'd earned it, which he had, and sent him back to work before either of them had to deal with any more of the moment than that. Joseph Red Cloud, who had been the first to believe in the whole enterprise when belief was still a risk, had by summer become the operation's informal supervisor of wagon maintenance, a role that suited him because it required the kind of attention to detail and patient problem-solving that were his native qualities. He didn't announce this shift. He just began doing it and did it well and expected to be paid fairly for it, which he was. One afternoon in August, he said to Savannah, without preamble, "This is going to outlast us." She looked up from the notebook. "What do you mean?" "I mean this thing you've built," he said. "It's going to be here after we're gone. Something real usually is." He went back to examining a wheel housing. She sat with that for a while. He wasn't wrong. There was something in the operation now that had taken on its own weight. The roots, the relationships, the daily rhythm of feeding people who needed to be fed. It did not need her specific hands on it every hour to continue. That was both the measure of what she'd built, and if she was honest, slightly disorienting. She had been so long in the mode of building that the idea of a thing that could sustain itself required some adjustment. On an evening in late September, almost exactly 1 year after the first wagon had gone out to Camp 7, there was something at Iron Creek Ranch that nobody had planned or organized. It simply happened. Margaret brought food from the kitchen. Rosa and her cousin came up from the South Road. The camp workers who had days off were in Mill Haven, and Mill Haven was close enough to the ranch that word traveled. Come out to Iron Creek. There's food. The Kinney Creek families came because Henrik mentioned it to 2 neighbors, and the 2 neighbors told 4 more. Eli's mother came, and she had never been to the ranch before. The mill workers and the mining crew and the freight haulers who stopped at the depot on Thursdays came because the depot had become a place where things were known, and this was one of the things that was known. By the time the sun was going down behind the western ridge, there were somewhere between 50 and 60 people in the yard of Iron Creek Ranch. They were eating and talking in 4 languages, and children were running between the wagons, and the smell of Marco's bread and Savannah's beans and Margaret's apple pie was in the air. The way smells are in the air when there is enough of something that the abundance itself becomes part of the occasion. Savannah stood at the edge of it and looked at it. She was not a sentimental woman. She did not cry easily, and she did not romanticize circumstances, and she was aware that this evening was the product of 7 months of hard work and difficult decisions, and 3 weeks of building in a state of uncertainty that had felt genuinely unbearable at several points. None of that went away just because the evening was warm and the people were glad to be there. But she looked at it, and she let it be what it was. Weston came and stood beside her. He had a cup of coffee, and he gave it to her without asking whether she wanted it, which she did. Henrik brought his daughters, she said. I saw them. Weston looked at the yard. The youngest one is giving Eli a hard time about something. She's 7, Savannah said. That's her job. They stood together in the way they had learned to stand together, not performing anything, not narrating the moment, just presenting it. This too had been built. Not quickly and not without friction and not without the occasional evening where they had sat at the kitchen table and talked past each other about something that mattered and arrived at understanding only after more work than either of them had wanted to put in. But it had been built, the same way everything else had been built, through attention and effort and the willingness to do the harder thing when the easier thing was available. Pete came over and stood beside Weston and looked at the yard and said, without directing it at anyone in particular, would have said this was impossible last October. You did say it was impossible, Cal called from 10 feet away, where he was eating bread with 2 of the Polish workers. I said it was unlikely, Pete said. There's a difference. There really isn't, Savannah said. Pete made the sound that meant he disagreed, but had decided not to fight about it, which was his version of conceding. He went back to the crowd. Later, after most people had gone and the yard was quieter, and the children were asleep in the backs of wagons waiting for their parents to be ready to leave, Savannah sat on the porch steps with her notebook in her lap. Not working, just holding it. She thought about the woman on the buckboard in October, sitting with her hands folded in her lap on a frozen road. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't known, and what she had been afraid of that she wouldn't have admitted to being afraid of. The thing she had been most afraid of, she understood now, was not that the operation would fail. She had been afraid that she would try seriously and still not be enough, that she would bring everything she had, the arithmetic, the attention, the willingness to work in the dark before anyone else was awake, and it still wouldn't matter because the world she had arrived in had already decided what she was for and had no mechanism for deciding otherwise. That fear was not irrational. The world she had arrived in had, in fact, made that decision. Langford had looked at her in a hotel parlor and processed her as a smaller thing than she was. Foss had directed his explanations at her husband. Hurst had come to the depot with a lowball offer that told her exactly what he thought she was worth and how frightened he assumed she must be. None of them had been right. But she wanted to be honest about this, at least with herself. The fact that they had not been right was not only because she had proved them wrong through effort, it was also because she had been lucky in specific ways. The railroad was expanding through this particular part of Wyoming at this particular time, which created the need she filled. The camps were hungry. The weather, bad as it was, had not been catastrophic. Weston had said one wagon when he could have said no. Joseph had said yes when she'd asked him to drive. She had worked very hard. She had also been lucky. Both things were true, and she thought it was important to hold both of them, because a person who only credits her own effort stops being able to see the people who helped her, and the circumstances that allowed it, and that kind of blindness was its own kind of failure. The door behind her opened, and Weston came out and sat on the step beside her, not close enough to be deliberate about it, just close enough that the space between them was the comfortable kind. "Margaret's cleaning up inside," he said. "I told her to leave it." "She won't leave it," Savannah said. "I know, but I told her." The yard was quiet now, just the horses and the distant sound of a conversation fading down the south road. The sky was enormous in the way Wyoming skies were enormous. Not pretty, exactly, but vast in a way that made the things under it feel both small and exactly the right size. "I want to talk about the extension option," Savannah said. "In the contract, if we execute well through next spring, they'll offer us a 3-year renewal." "I know," Weston said. 3 years is long enough to add permanent infrastructure. Not wagons, a building. A commissary operation, possibly, that can service the camps and the settlements both from a fixed location with wagons as distribution. "That's a different kind of investment," Weston said. "Yes," she said. "I want to think through it carefully before we commit to anything. But I want you to know I'm thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment. "What would we need?" "Land adjacent to the main route. A building. Expanded cold storage. The insulation boxes work for mobile service, but a fixed location can do better." She turned the notebook over in her hands. "I'll work the numbers over the winter." "You'll have them by November," he said. Not sarcastically, just knowing her. "Probably October," she admitted. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. Brief, genuine, surprised at itself. She had come to value that sound more than she could easily explain. She looked at the yard, at the wagons, at the barn with its repaired roof. "Weston," she said. Do you know what I thought when I first saw this place? When we drove up that road in October?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I never asked." "I thought it looked like a place that had given up on itself," she said. "Not completely, but partially. Like a person who's stopped believing they're going to figure it out." He didn't say anything. "I don't think that now," she said. He turned and looked at her. In the low evening light, his face was not unreadable the way it had once seemed to her. She understood it now too well for that. She saw what was there, the steadiness and the quiet pride and the thing underneath both of them that he had been working toward saying for some time. "Neither do I," he said. They sat on the steps of Iron Creek Ranch as the September night came on. Two people who had started as strangers in business arrangements and had become, through the particular alchemy of shared difficulty and shared purpose, something that neither of them had a word for yet, but that both of them recognized. That was enough. More than enough. Sometimes the most real things don't need naming right away. They just need tending. The way a ranch needs tending. The way a business needs tending. The way anything worth keeping needs the daily commitment of someone who shows up and does the work even on the days when showing up is the hardest part. Savannah had learned this. Or maybe she had always known it, and the frontier had simply given her a large enough canvas to prove it to herself. She closed the notebook. Tomorrow there was a supply run, and 4 wagons to load, and 11 camps to reach before midday, and a future that was neither guaranteed nor finished. She was looking forward to it.
To animal fur, wet block for acrylic and plants. Okay. Oh, hello, Delta. Welcome in. Thank you so much for the raid.
The vessel is hailing.
Delta Trader, tell us what you were up to tonight. Delta Trader's class was just dismissed and they're bringing the ADHD chaos. Well, I fucking love that. We love chaos here. Thank you for bringing your community over to us. And we are all about the ADHD chaos. Marker chips. What's a marker chip? That's cool. Oh, I like that cute emote. That's really cute. I love it. That is adorable. Maker chip. Oh, wait, is that like for 3D printing? Is that what you mean? We got to do the wobble. Wobble, y'all. But hell yeah. Can we get a shout out for Delta? 3D designers make their own chips to hand out to folks. Yes, I've heard about that. That's hell awesome. Oh, you did? I'm sorry. I'm derping. Thank you, Cranston. Tell me you can I'm new here. Okay? Hi. Hi everybody. I'm new to streaming. I don't know how this thing works. Oh, it's been a week, man. It's been well, I was off for about a week. Excuse me. We like to teach 3D design. We make it easier for all new printers. Oh, nice. That's awesome. Hell yeah. Right. I still need a first day on the job. Exactly. My first day on the job, y'all. I don't know what we do around here, but you know, we're gonna do stuff and things. Yeah, no, I remember. I've been wanting to check out your channel, Delta, to learn the things and stuff. For folks who are new here, we do a little bit of everything. However, the ADHD hyper focus likes to dictate what we're doing. Mostly fiber arts lately, but we are going to be doing some 3D printing for a friend. And then I also have got some other stuff in the works as well, like my Cosplay project to set up my industrial sewing machine to get that started. I'm really excited about it, but it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot. So give me just a second. My nose is acting up.